Dr. Elara Keene's lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy. Her reputation as a bold xenobiologist had spread far beyond the quiet corridors of the Earth Colonial University. Students from multiple species had flocked to her class this semester, driven by rumors that she was about to conduct an unprecedented experiment. When she stepped onto the podium, the room immediately fell silent. Keene had the kind of commanding presence that could quiet a room without speaking. She was in her mid-30s with piercing green eyes and an intensity that made her seem both brilliant and slightly dangerous. Today, her expression betrayed more than her usual academic passion. There was an undercurrent of excitement and something else. With a flick of her wrist, she activated the holographic projector. The room dimmed, and the image of the galaxy appeared, glittering with stars, worlds, and countless civilizations. But among these, a specific type of world stood out. Red dots scattered across the spiral arms, marking the known Deathworlds. These planets, Dr. Keene began, her voice steady and crisp, are considered nearly uninhabitable by most sentient life. Extreme environments, fierce predators, chaotic ecosystems. For centuries, we've marveled at how certain species evolved on these planets and survived the daily violence of their ecosystems. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Humans come from one such world. Rika, sitting near the back of the hall, felt a knot of unease in her stomach. She wasn't from Earth, and her species, the delicate amphibious Serenians, had always looked at Deathworlders like humans with a mix of awe and caution. Earth, with its violent storms, unpredictable tectonic activity, and dangerous fauna, was the stuff of legend in the wider galaxy. Dr. Keene's voice deepened. Survival on a Deathworld has forced humans and a few other species to evolve in ways we don't yet fully understand. But there's a theory, a radical one. Some believe that humans and perhaps other Deathworlders aren't just surviving in hostile conditions, they're becoming invincible in them. A murmur rippled through the students. Rika's heart skipped a beat. Invincible? I know it sounds like science fiction, Dr. Keene continued, but I've seen some evidence that suggests there's more to the human body's reaction to extreme stress than we thought. And I aim to prove it. She tapped the hologram, and the image shifted to show a simulation chamber. Starting today, we will conduct a series of controlled experiments to push the limits of human endurance. We'll expose volunteers to conditions that should incapacitate or kill them, if the theory is wrong. The silence was deafening. Rika's hands clenched the edge of her seat. Was Dr. Keene serious? Were they really going to test the very limits of human biology? Of life itself? Dr. Keene's eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly on each of her students, as if daring them to challenge her. If the theory holds, she said softly, we may find that Deathworlders, especially humans, are far more resilient, perhaps even indestructible, than we ever imagined. Rika shifted uncomfortably. She had a sinking feeling this experiment was about to uncover something far more terrifying than mere resilience. The laboratory was an imposing structure of steel and glass, buried deep within the Earth Colonial University. On the morning of the first experiment, Rika arrived early, watching nervously as the test chamber was prepared. Massive machines hummed with energy, sensors and monitors blinked to life, and technicians scurried about with a sense of focused urgency. Dr. Keene arrived soon after, looking entirely too calm for what was about to happen. Rika wondered if the woman felt any doubt at all, or if she was so certain in her theory that the potential dangers were just irrelevant. Today's test subject is Eric, Dr. Keene announced, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the room. Eric was a tall, muscular man with an easygoing demeanor, an Earth-born student with a cocky grin that hadn't faded since the experiment was announced. He stepped forward, waving casually to his peers, seemingly unfazed by what was about to happen. The test chamber loomed before him, a sleek, metallic room equipped with every kind of sensor imaginable. It was designed to simulate extreme environments in precise detail. Today they would test human resistance to cold, bone-chilling, deathly cold. Dr. Keene glanced at the temperature gauge. The chamber will simulate temperatures below freezing, then drop further to near sub-zero levels. In theory, Eric should experience the onset of hypothermia within minutes. Eric's breath fogged as he entered the chamber, and the door sealed behind him with a mechanical hiss. The temperature inside immediately began to plummet. On the observation screens, his vitals appeared: heart rate, breathing, body temperature. Rika watched closely, nerves buzzing. At first, everything seemed normal. Eric exhaled small clouds of condensation, rubbing his hands together, but as the minutes ticked by, something strange happened. His body temperature dropped far slower than expected. The chamber grew colder and colder, frost covering the walls, but Eric just stood there, looking mildly uncomfortable. After 15 minutes, the temperature had reached levels that should have had him shivering uncontrollably, his body desperately trying to retain heat. But Eric's vitals remained steady. Dr. Keen's brow furrowed as she watched. "Increase the severity," she ordered. The technicians complied, and the temperature plunged further. By now, it was cold enough that a normal human should have collapsed, their body fighting a losing battle against hypothermia. Eric should have been on the verge of death, but he wasn't. Rika stared at the monitors. Eric's heart rate had slowed, yes, and his breathing was deeper, but there were no signs of organ failure, no indications that his body was succumbing to the cold. His temperature dropped, but it plateaued at a point that should have been unsustainable, yet he was still conscious, still standing. "Shut it down," Dr. Keen ordered. When the chamber returned to normal temperature, Eric emerged, his skin pale but otherwise unharmed. "That wasn't as bad as I thought," he said with a grin, rubbing the back of his neck. The room was silent. Dr. Keen's eyes flickered with something like triumph. Rika, however, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold experiment. Something wasn't right. By the third day of experiments, the mood in the lab had shifted from curiosity to confusion. Every human subjected to the trials exhibited the same inexplicable results. What had begun with cold tests soon escalated to trials involving extreme heat, high radiation, and crushing pressure. The outcomes were consistent. The humans survived. No, they did more than survive. They adapted. They thrived. Rika's anxiety grew as each new test yielded similar results. Her fellow students, some of them from non-Deathworld species, whispered in disbelief. How could it be possible that humans were withstanding these conditions? By now, several of her classmates had been tested as well, including species from milder worlds, and the contrast was stark. Most non-humans had to exit the trials early, their bodies overwhelmed by the simulations, their vital signs dipping into dangerous zones. But the humans kept enduring, kept evolving. It wasn't long before Rika noticed something even more unsettling. The humans weren't just surviving, they were changing. She sat in her dorm one night, poring over the data she had collected during the experiments. It was subtle at first, almost too small to notice, but after each trial, the human subjects showed a slight increase in physical capacity. Whether it was enhanced reflexes, improved stamina, or even faster recovery from minor injuries, their bodies seemed to be learning from the stress and adapting. Rika brought her findings to Dr. Keen the next day, her heart pounding in her chest. "There's something happening to them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're getting stronger." Dr. Keen's face remained unreadable as she studied the data. "Interesting," she murmured. "It's as if their bodies are not just healing from the damage, but improving as a result." Rika felt her stomach churn. "How is that possible? That's not how evolution works." "It's not evolution in the traditional sense," Dr. Keen replied, her eyes glinting. "It's something else, something far more immediate." Rika didn't like the sound of that. Evolution was a slow process, something that happened over millennia. This was happening in real time. The implications were terrifying. As the experiments continued, Dr. Keen began to push the limits even further. The simulations became more dangerous, simulating environments with toxic gases, deadly viruses, and gravitational forces that should have crushed human bones. But each time the humans walked out unharmed, their bodies seemingly adapting faster than the danger could overwhelm them. By now, whispers of the experiments had begun to circulate throughout the campus. Rumors spread like wildfire, and soon even the non-human students were asking questions. What was happening to the humans? Why were they able to withstand conditions that should have killed them? Rika knew the answer, or at least she was beginning to. The humans weren't just survivors of a death world. They were something else entirely, something more. The final experiment was scheduled for the end of the term, and the atmosphere in the lab was thick with tension. This would be the most extreme simulation yet, a combination of all the previous trials. Dr. Keene called it the absolute test. It was designed to replicate the harshest conditions in the galaxy: deep space vacuum, temperatures near absolute zero, and lethal levels of radiation. Only one human volunteer had agreed to take part: Alex, a quiet, unassuming student who had always kept to the background. He didn't possess the same bravado as Eric or the others, but something about him was different. He had a quiet determination, a calm confidence that unnerved Rika. The test chamber loomed like a steel coffin as Alex entered, and Rika felt a sinking feeling in her gut. She had spent countless nights poring over the data, trying to find a rational explanation for the results. But nothing made sense. The only conclusion she could come to was one she refused to believe. Humans were evolving into something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Dr. Keene stood at the control panel, her fingers dancing over the keys. "This will be our most demanding simulation yet," she said. "We'll monitor closely, but if my hypothesis is correct, Alex should be able to withstand it." The test began. First, the air was sucked out of the chamber, simulating the vacuum of space. Rika's heart pounded as she watched Alex's vitals on the screen. His oxygen levels dropped, but then, miraculously, his body seemed to compensate. His heart rate slowed, his breathing shallow but steady. Next came the cold. Temperatures plummeted to levels that would freeze blood within seconds. But again, Alex's vitals remained steady. His skin frosted over, but his core temperature stabilized at a level that should have been impossible. Finally, the radiation spiked. The levels were deadly, enough to kill most species within minutes. But Alex's body didn't just resist, it adapted. Rika watched in horror as his cells seemed to regenerate faster than the radiation could damage them. His body was healing itself in real time, becoming stronger with every passing moment. "This isn't possible," Rika whispered, her voice trembling. Dr. Keene leaned forward, her eyes alight with discovery. "Oh, it's very possible." When the test finally ended, Alex stepped out of the chamber. He looked pale, his clothes singed, but he was alive. More than alive. He looked sharper, stronger, more aware. His eyes locked onto Dr. Keene, and for a brief moment, Rika saw something in his gaze that sent a chill down her spine. It was power. Humans weren't just Deathworlders. They were something else now, something far beyond mere survival. They were evolving into a species that could endure and perhaps even dominate any environment in the galaxy. As Dr. Keene congratulated Alex, Rika felt a cold dread settle over her. The experiment had proven more than just a theory. It had revealed a truth that could change everything. Humans were no longer bound by the limits of biology or evolution. They were becoming something more, something invincible. And the galaxy would soon realize the full extent of what that meant.